Sometimes I really miss the time when English was the only foreign language I had to study. Since then, I've been having a really bad case of FOMO, to the point where I have to stop myself from learning a new language every single week. And I do admit that if you're choosing to focus on more than one language at a time, you are slowing down your progress for each of the languages that you study. But at the same time, I'm also not really willing to sacrifice any of my languages. So last year, for example, I was studying 6, and in today's video I wanted to share a little bit about how I go about learning multiple languages at the same time. I don't want you to consider it as advice, because I think in the end of the day my only advice to you would be to do what works best for you and your circumstances. But I also think that sometimes being exposed to other people's routines or ideas on language learning kind of helps us get some ideas of what we can actually try before we find that one thing that works for us. So yeah, these are the guidelines that I made for myself, and hopefully you find them helpful to understand what works best for you. So the first 2 rules work well together, meaning that I can technically only break 1 but not 2 at the same time. First of all, I don't really think it's a good idea to be studying 2 similar languages at the same time, and I'm talking Spanish and Italian similar, unless you already have at least an intermediate level in one of those. And then the second rule that I have for myself is to not start 2 languages from scratch at the same time. So here's an example. Learning Spanish and Italian from scratch at the same time will probably make you spend a lot of brain power and energy, not on just learning things like grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, but also on not mixing them up. On the other hand, what has worked for me was learning Spanish to a B2-ish level, and then using materials for native Spanish speakers to study Italian. This way, you're not even learning the second language from scratch. At this point, you're just building on top of the knowledge that you already have from learning the first language. For example, I have my Italian book here, and it is for Spanish speakers, as you can tell, and it doesn't really introduce grammar or vocabulary as if I have never heard of them before. What it does instead is, when it talks about a certain, let's say, grammatical tense, it just says something like, well, this in Italian is virtually the same thing as this tense in Spanish, but the main differences are this, and that. And the same goes for vocabulary. Like, the book doesn't really waste your time explaining things that are already intuitively clear to you just because you speak Spanish, but instead it kind of highlights the differences. But even if we're talking about 2 completely different languages, like let's say Italian and Japanese, I still think it's not the best idea to start learning them from scratch at the same time. I kind of view it as having twins instead of having one baby at a time. Is it impossible? No. Have people done it before? Definitely. But is it really hard? Yeah, I think so. Okay, now that I know what languages I'm going to be studying, it's time to set priorities, because chances are I'm not going to be able to spend the same amount of time on all of my languages, and honestly, that's perfectly fine. To figure out what my priorities are, it really helps to know what my learning style is, what works for me and what doesn't, as well as just kind of general life circumstance. For example, back when I lived in Korea or in Spain, their respective languages, well, Castellano in the case of Spain, because Spain has more than one language, were my priorities at that time. Now that I'm not really restricted by any life circumstance, I can just go with whatever I feel like learning. Sometimes also to prevent burnout and make it a little easier for myself, I like to choose the mode in which I study a certain language. For example, Spanish, most of the time for me, is in maintenance mode. I know it well enough where I don't have to be actively studying grammar, even though that wouldn't hurt. So for Spanish, my goals usually look like read a book a month, or find a podcast that I really like, or maybe watch this new show that's coming out, or something like that. Whereas my beginner languages, of course, require more time, so the mode in which I study them is going to be different too. However, at the same time, I have made this mistake before where I would use Spanish because it's one of the stronger languages for me for all of the fun activities like watching TV shows, listening to podcasts, listening to audiobooks and reading. And then for my beginner languages like Polish, let's say, which is the most recent case, I would just do hardcore studying. And this is honestly the best way to turn learning that beginner language into a chore. So maybe don't do that. But I think it helps to not be doing the same thing for all of your languages and instead choose different modes or different priorities for each of the languages. Another thing that I think is really helpful is to know how you prefer to approach studying multiple languages. For example, sometimes on Twitter, I see people tweeting their daily reports about the stuff that they did, and I will say things like 10 minutes of Dutch, 20 minutes of German, 20 minutes of French, 30 minutes of, Japanese. That could never be me. I could never study all of my languages every single day, but for like 20 minutes each. No. At the same time, I'm also not the kind of person who does like Turkish Mondays, German Tuesdays, Mandarin Chinese Wednesdays. What I tend to do is I just get obsessed with the language and I go all in for a month or 2 or 3. And for that time, I only study that language intensively. And then there's another language that is like in maintenance mode, but usually for me it's Spanish. So I'll be doing some things in Spanish, not really actively studying, but for active studying and for the majority of immersion, that will be that one language. For example, right now for me it's Italian. A couple of months ago it was Polish. Back in the beginning of 2022 it was Japanese. So that's how I do it. At the same time, there are people who prefer to focus on one language for a year or 2 before moving on to the next one. And that could not be me either, because after spending 2 to 3 months with a language, I kind of get sick of it and I start craving something new, even if that new is one of the languages that I had already studied before. So that's kind of how I do it, and it wouldn't make sense for me to try to force myself to study any other way, like practice all of my languages on the same day or dedicate certain days of the week to a language. I am perfectly comfortable with my study style, and the only problem that I had along the way was figuring out that that is what my style is. Another thing that I try to do is I try to define what exactly it is that I want from a certain language. And I don't really know if it's obvious to you guys. It hasn't always been obvious to me that I don't really have to take all of my languages and all of the skills in those languages to an advanced level. Korean, for example, I've been learning it on and off since I want to say 2012, but it was only a couple of years ago that I finally realized that I don't have to be fluent at speaking Korean, because when it comes to this language, most of my goals have to do with reading or better understanding some of the more complicated videos that I watch on YouTube, like something that has to do with popular psychology or history or things like that. But speaking the language, I don't really need it, so there's no need to spend money on tutors or feel bad if my speaking skills are not as good as, let's say, my listening or reading. For Spanish, on the other hand, I used to focus on things like reading and listening, but now speaking is actually becoming more important, given that I now have a family member who only speaks Spanish. Once I'm clear on what my priorities are, I try to schedule study session in a way that reflects those priorities. I also try to attach my language habits to non-language habits that I already have. For example, I usually use apps like Duolingo while I'm having breakfast, or I will listen to a podcast or an audiobook when I'm walking my dog. I don't need to tell you that language learning is already pretty hard, but when you are self-studying, it's even harder, because your task is not only to actually learn the language, but you are also the one in charge of designing your study plan, choosing the materials, deciding what to learn and in which order, and then multiply that by however many languages you are learning, and that can get super overwhelming super fast. Because of that, if that's something that you can afford short, it sometimes makes sense to delegate some of that work for some of your languages to a tutor. I don't really think that someone else can teach you the language. You still have to put in a lot of work. But I do believe that they can provide useful structure and guidance that will take some work off your shoulders. I have to be honest with you, I'm not really big on language goals, but I live for what I call language projects. Saying something like, I want to achieve B2 by the end of the year is alright, I guess, but to me, it doesn't really give me any idea on what exactly it is that I have to do to reach that level. At the same time, I have also told you that I tend to switch my focus all of the time. I recently did some language planning back in mid-December of last year, and then I was looking at the plans that I had made in the beginning of January, and a lot of that stuff already seemed so irrelevant to me because my focus had switched completely during those 2 weeks. What I do instead is I think of a project or 2 or 10 or even more for each of the languages that I study. I'm going to give you some examples of the projects that I completed in 2022. I, for example, listened to my first audiobook in Spanish. I also found a podcast I like, and I listened to more than 10 episodes of that podcast. I also finished the graded reader in Italian, and I completed my Genki 1 textbook for Japanese. And right now, for example, for my focus languages, my projects are read a children's book that I have. It's about scripts and writing systems in Italian, which is super cool, I think. Another project is to finish Italian Foundations 1 on Duolingo, so not even the whole Duolingo tree. It's not even a tree anymore, but you know what I'm saying. And then another project of mine is to listen to Los Detectives Salvajes, which is an audiobook in Spanish. Considering that all of those projects are more or less different from each other, it also kind of allows me to mix and match different activities without constantly doing the same thing for all of my languages. Plus, I'm the kind of person who just loves making lists and then checking things off. So having those small projects that I can complete in a relatively short amount of time gives me a lot of motivation to go on. Another reason why I don't like those big yearly goals is because if I didn't achieve exactly what the goal says I should have achieved, then I kind of feel like a failure, and I do not want to feel like that, especially when it comes to a hobby. So what I do instead is I have all of my projects listed out in a Notion database, and then as soon as I mark something as complete, it goes into this separate view that has all of the projects that I've completed this year. So then when December comes, instead of looking at my goals and trying to figure out whether I achieved them or not, what I can do is I can just go to that little achievements tab and look at all of the projects that I have completed. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that instead of setting goals for myself, I prefer to have something like a bucket list for each one of my languages. Some of them are more ambitious, some of them less, and I can pick whatever I'm vibing with at the moment, and if I achieve something, that's great. If I don't, that's okay too. Not everything on that list is meant to be completed or achieved. And then finally, another thing that I do to make sure I don't forget one of my languages while I'm trying to learn another one is something that is called laddering, which basically means learning your weaker language using your stronger one. For example, as I have said before, I learn Italian with a Spanish textbook. I also sometimes would use Korean textbooks back when I was actively studying Japanese. Another thing that I do all the time is I use materials in English for learning my other languages, which I still, for example, remember the word precipitation that I learned only because I was in my Korean class and they gave us a list of words, and the word kansurang in Korean was there and the translation was precipitation, and I had no idea what kansurang or precipitation was, so I kind of had to learn both at the same time, and I still remember both. Most importantly, when it comes to language learning, I just try to not compare myself to others too much, to have fun and not turn this hobby of mine into a chore. So this is how I do it, but I would also love to know how you approach studying multiple languages at the same time. Are you the kind of person who prefers to master one before they move on to the next one? Or maybe you study like 3 or 4 languages on the same day? Please do tell me in the comments down below. And as always, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!